We just finished celebrating Constitution Week. So in Congress, one congressman tweeted out the Constitution 140 characters at a time. That was kind of creative. Barack Obama celebrated by doing one more unconstitutional thing. He won an unconstitutional war this week. That's not an unusual week for him because he didn't do many unconstitutional things in a week, really. I mean, whether it's amending legislation, creating legislation, doing by executive order, things that really were never intended to be done by the president, he's been pretty good at that. He's pretty blasé about the whole thing. And I tell people what's disappointing, and one of the things I said in the speech today, what I said frankly to Secretary Kerry yesterday in committee was that, you know, I didn't vote for the president, I'll admit that, all right? But there were some things that he said when he ran that were actually pretty good. In 2007, he said, no president should unilaterally go to war without the authority of Congress. He restated the Constitution as constitutional belief. And yet apparently that was good as a candidate, but not so good as a president. The Libyan war, completely fought without any approval. He came, we had a conversation with him one time at lunch, and I raised my hand. This was a year later. This was last year when we were thinking about bombing Assad. And I said, well, you said that you would never do this unless there was an imminent threat to the country, or if we were in imminent danger. And he said, well, in Libya there was an imminent threat to Benghazi. And I'm like, I don't think anybody understood that the new standard for war of imminent threat would be when a foreign city was under attack by a foreign government or by foreign fighters. That was somehow an imminent threat to the United States. But they completely don't get this, and there's a disconnect. And even the people who give lip service to this really don't believe it. So we had this debate in our committee yesterday, the Foreign Relations Committee. Half the Republicans, half the Democrats, everybody has some criticism over where's your use of force, where's your declaration of war. Everybody criticizes him, but then everybody's like, oh, well, it's an election and we're going home and we don't really have time. We'll just do it in December. So, I mean, it becomes no big deal when it's just really blasé. In fact, Kerry has this convoluted argument that a vote in 2001 to go into Afghanistan somehow authorizes him to combat ISIS or go to war in Syria. That a vote in 2001 about Afghanistan has something to do with what we're currently contemplating. And I had a quote from Ambassador Ford, who spoke yesterday, and he said in it that many of the moderate rebels are or will be either purposely or not purposely allied and work jointly with Al-Qaeda. And I said, by your logic, if you say that we can go after terrorists anywhere in the world who might be Al-Qaeda or might be cooperating or associating with Al-Qaeda, you're saying the use of authorization of force from 2001 could actually be used against the people you're wanting now to supply. I mean, that's bizarre. It makes absolutely no sense. And so then he said, oh, it doesn't matter because I have Article 2. You know, Article 2 is what the president can do. And it's like, there's nothing in there that says the president. In fact, the whole Constitution, the debate, the Federalist Papers, all of this was about Congress limiting, about Congress having the jurisdiction. You know, Madison says this. He says, the executive branch is that branch most prone to go to war. Therefore, we specifically delegated that and gave it to the legislature. With regard to general legislation, Montesquieu, who many of the founding fathers looked to, said that when the executive presumes to legislate, that a form of tyranny ensues. The whole idea was to separate the powers. In fact, it's one of the things that is just primary and fundamental about our constitutional republic is the checks and balances between the branches. But most people say, what are you going to do about it? It is kind of difficult. It's hard to get into court. I remember many years ago, my dad back in the 1980s, they sued because a tax bill originated in the Senate instead of the House. And the Constitution says revenue-raising bills have to originate in the House. Well, what they did is they took a tax bill, stripped it of all the information, and used the same number in the Senate, but then they wrote the tax bill in the Senate, clearly against the wishes of what the framers of the Constitution wanted. And they sued, but the court said, oh, you don't have standing. And it's a technical legal thing, but it's like, that's what happens. Whenever politicians sue, or even if you sue, and say what they've done is unconstitutional, the courts often say, unless you have standing, we won't hear the suit. So we are somewhat hamstrung by what we can do legally. We can always unelect a few people, and you've got an election coming up, and I highly recommend an election. Was anybody here bothered by the sight of mine-resistant vehicles and assault weapons pointed at unarmed people in Ferguson? We don't have images of what happened to the young man. You know, we may never know the truth, but there will be an investigation as to what happened to the young unarmed man that was shot 5 times. But we do have images, and there's one image of an unarmed man protesting with his hands up like this and a drawn assault weapon pointed at him from a short distance. That's not what we need in our country. In the background, there's mine-resistant vehicles, mine-resistant ambush protection vehicles. They weigh 20 tons. You know, we've given out 600 of them. The town of Dundee, Michigan has 3,000 people, and they've got a mine-resistant ambush protection. They've got one town that got 15 assault rifles, and they have 1 policeman in the town. I mean, just crazy stuff like this. The upkeep on these vehicles is more than the budget of most of these communities. Most communities end up just having them sitting around because they can't even pay for the upkeep of these vehicles. But here's the problem. Written in the rules, and this is what my question was. I asked 2 questions. I said, I see that you gave out 12,000 bayonets. Can you explain to me how a bayonet is used in normal policing? They didn't have a good explanation, and so it's like, well, if you don't think there's a use for a bayonet, why don't you stop? It's like, a lot of bumbling and, mumbling around. It's like, the administration could stop that tomorrow. When you see something dumb, like giving out 12,000 bayonets, just stop doing it. We were asking him these questions about, what you can do and what you can't do, and the bayonets really stuck out to me. But 600 mine-resistant vehicles, and I think 80,000 assault rifles. And the thing is that you wonder, and you say to yourself, who really is in charge of this? But Senator McCaskill had a good question. She said, I see that 1/3 of your surplus equipment is actually classified as new. I want to know if you're getting new equipment and then giving it away to cities and then replacing it with more new equipment. That sounds like maybe somebody's getting rich off a process of resupplying this equipment. But we've just it's gotten out of control, what we've done in our policing. And I got to thinking about this, and when my wife and I were married 20-some odd years ago, I guess I should be more precise, so I'll get in trouble. nearly 25 years ago, we used to like Michelle Shocked. Anybody ever heard of Michelle Shocked? She was big in the 80s. Yeah, that one fell pretty flat. Back in the ancient days, in the 1980s, she had a great song, and it was called, we thought it was great, it was called Graffiti Limbo. And it was a song about a guy named Michael Stewart. And part of it, she explains the story. Michael Stewart was a young black graffiti artist in New York City. And he was accosted while spray painting the walls by 11 white transit cops. Michael Stewart was strangled to death. The cops were never found guilty. The evidence was lost, and they're still on the beat. But that's what I was thinking about when I heard the story of Michael Brown. I'm thinking about Michael Stewart from 30 years ago, and I'm trying to connect the dots and figure out what went wrong. I mean, I have a lot of good friends who are policemen or FBI agents who work in government. A lot of good people work in government. But the thing is maybe it's the rules. Maybe it's that we went crazy somehow thinking that, the situation where there's a hostage taker, you want your police to be aggressive. But if someone's got some pot, do you want them to break down the door at 2 in the morning with masks and tear gas and concussion grenades? 2 quick stories. In 2002, I think it was, there was a Modesto, California, the Sepulveda family. No-knock raid, 3 in the morning. They break in, they think they're being attacked. It calms down, and they tell everybody to get on the floor. The 11-year-old boy, Alberto, gets on the floor, hands and knees, and they've got a shotgun to his back, and it accidentally discharges and kills him. Why are we doing this? To find some marijuana. I don't think there was any drugs in the house. It was the wrong house. You know, we have done this repeatedly. Anybody see the story of the little baby that got the concussion grenade thrown in? This is about 2 months ago. Same thing. And we put this on our Facebook, and I was disappointed at some, you don't know who else on your Facebook, first of all. So be careful what you say on your Facebook. But so we put this on our Facebook, and people responded to this, and some people were like, well, why were they there? They were with bad people. They're sort of their fault for associating with bad people. And what I was thinking of is that, not everybody's got a perfect life. Not everybody's got enough money to always have a good place to live. Their house had burned down. They were staying with friends, and they knew that this wasn't a really good place for them and their 4 kids, but they were in transition, trying to get to a better place. They don't deserve to have had a concussion grenade thrown in their baby's playpen. And that's what happened. It blew up in the baby's face. It was just awful. The baby's in a coma for weeks and probably will be permanently disfigured. But it's because we got away from, I'm okay with the police using force. I'm okay if there's a hostage and my wife's being captured. I want them to burst in and try to save her. But if there's somebody saying some kid's got pot in the house, I think it's a little crazy to have this war on drugs have gone so far. I've spent the last year trying to take the liberty message to new audiences. I think that if we take our liberty message that every individual is precious and should be defended, every individual has rights, every individual has a right to a lawyer, and also understand that the people who are getting the worst end of government, the worst people getting the worst end of when police misbehave are black and brown. There happens to be more poverty in the Hispanic and the African American community, and they get the brunt of this. If you look at who's in jail for the war on drugs, it's African Americans and Hispanics. And people used to say, oh, well, they're just doing more drugs. It's not true. You look at surveys, drugs are used about the same among all the races. 80% of the people are white. How did we get 3/4 of the people in prison black or brown? Something's wrong with the war on drugs. Most libertarian people have always said this, but you know what? Keep saying this and point out to your friends who haven't been open either to liberty message or may not have been Republican or may not have been voting for constitutional candidates. Point out to them that you're for getting rid of this and you understand what it's done to their community. The Washington Post has done a whole series on civil forfeiture. This is where the police just take your stuff. Sometimes it's your truck, sometimes it's your cash, but you're guilty until you can prove that you got your money in an innocent way. Sometimes you're not even charged. A guy named Mandrell Stewart was going down the road with $17,000. Now I admit that's a little suspicious, all right? He said he had a restaurant. Maybe he wasn't paying his taxes. I don't know, but it's a free country. You should have to prove he did something wrong before you take his money. They took his money. They never charged him with anything. They took his vehicle. His business went out, he was going to pay his employees, he was going to buy stuff from it for his small little restaurant. But he went out of business completely. They finally, a year later, with the Institute for Justice lawyer, which is a great group if you ever keep up with them, they finally, a year later, said, oh, you can have half of it back, half of your money back. And he's like, well, what are you acknowledging? I'm innocent, but I get only half of it back, or I'm guilty and you're going to give me half of it back and it's money from a crime. They just figure they can take half of it because they're powerful and he's weak. And so he finally got all his money back, but he lost his business in the process. We've introduced bills to change the burden of proof to make it harder on the government to get these cases. If you're found innocent, you get your stuff back automatically. We've instituted bills to expunge your record if you had a minor nonviolent felony years ago. I have a friend, one of my best friends in Kentucky, his brother, 30 years ago in college, had marijuana plants and got a felony conviction. He can't vote. So many times Republicans are seen as this party of, we don't want black people to vote because they're voting Democrat, or we don't want Hispanics to vote because they're voting Democrat. You wonder why the Republican Party is so small. Why don't we be the party that's for people voting, for voting rights? So I testified in Frankfurt, our state capital. On one side it was the president of the NAACP. On the other side, a longtime Democratic congressman. And I said, frankly, it's wrong. People make mistakes when they're kids. They should get a second chance. So I've been trying to promote types of legislation that I think are consistent with the liberty message, but that also reach out to new people who haven't been interested in limited government before. And we've taken this to Detroit. I've told them, frankly, look, I'm for bailing out Detroit with their own money. I'm for saying they can keep their own money. So we introduced a bill to dramatically lower taxes in Detroit for 10 years. And it adds up to $1.3 billion. Not that I'm taking from you, not that I take from Atlanta or Houston or Virginia, just money that originated in Detroit will never come to Washington, which is really a good idea with most of it. But the bottom line is, we're not winning, at least the big office, presidency. We're often not winning statewide races. And we're not winning because we don't have enough people, and it's pretty simple. We don't have enough people in the group yet. So I think the liberty movement has actually been more open to receiving people of all walks of life who don't always look like you do or act like you do or have the same interests. I think we have actually been much more open sometimes than the Republican Party in general has. But it is the way you win elections. You got to have more people. And I'll end with my dad's favorite quote that I always thought was the best thing he ever had to say was, freedom is popular. Bring it on.